Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans. What an exciting qualifying session for the 2023 Brazilian Grand Prix at the Autodromo Jose Carlos Pace in Sao Paulo. Max Verstappen is again on pole position in Interlagos, but it was a really thrilling qualifying session. In Q1, there was only half a second between first and 17th place. Max Verstappen also had to put on several fresh sets of soft tyres during qualifying, so there really was a lot going on, and there was also a weather caper at the very end of the session. Aston Martin and especially Lance Stroll may have benefited from this. Question mark, exclamation mark, question mark. The Canadian made it into Q3 for the first time since Spa, i.e. for the first time since the summer break, and he put the AMR 23 in third place on the grid for Sunday's Grand Prix. Fernando Alonso was right behind him in fourth place. Now everyone is wondering whether it was just luck or skill on the part of both Lance Stroll and Aston Martin to finally get the car running again. Aston Martin, as you have no doubt seen, opened Q3. Very difficult conditions, a change in the weather, and of course they wanted to be the first car on the track. But the Aston Martins had a slight advantage because there were 5 different teams in Q3: Aston Martin, McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, and of course Red Bull. And of these 5 teams, Aston Martin was the weakest team in the Constructors' Championship last season. This means that their garage is relatively far up front in Brazil in the pit lanes, which of course allows them to react to the others, and that's exactly what Aston Martin did. They knew they wanted to be the first cars on the track. They looked closely at what the others were doing when they would let their drivers out of the garage, and then they reacted, putting both Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll ahead of the competition. Why do you want to be at the pit exit for a relatively short time? The modern Formula One cars can do that because you can switch off the engine and restart it yourself via the MGU-K, but of course you still want to stop as briefly as possible so that the tires don't lose too much temperature. That's exactly what happened with Mercedes, for example, who were directly behind Aston Martin in the queue, and that's why things didn't go so well in Q3. And Aston Martin's tires had cooled down a bit, even more than Mercedes, because they waited at least a few seconds longer, but they had the best conditions on the track. They had a clear run and were able to turn that to their advantage. Now, some people are saying that it was just luck that they finished so far ahead, and especially that Lance Stroll finished ahead of Fernando Alonso. I say no, Lance Stroll was already ahead of Fernando Alonso in Q1 in 6th position, Alonso in 7th. Then it was the other way around in Q2, but it looked like Fernando Alonso was really struggling with his teammate throughout the entire qualifying session. I said in the editorial office that I didn't like Alonso today, not because the whole thing was so strong, but because he just didn't look as strong as usual within the team. And then, when it came down to it, Lance Stroll simply conjured up the better lap, was another 0.5 of a second faster than the veteran. So credit where credit is due at this point. Then we said, of course it was an advantage to have the better garage, but he also had to get into Q3 first, which is where he failed on the last few race weekends. The Aston Martin is still a bit of a mystery. I almost had a bit of a row with team boss Mike Crack last time out in Mexico City. I said, well, you are somehow completely lost. You don't know where the journey is going. Updates come, then they're not on the car again, then you change specifications again. In the last 2 races, 3 times one of their cars started from the pit lane. Mike Crack said, no, we are not lost. Has he now proved me wrong with this performance? I would say yes and no, because you've already seen that the Aston Martin works better in Sao Paulo, but they went back to an older specification of the floor. In other words, the specification that was also modified in Austin and Mexico, at least for Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso in Austin. That's why they started from the pit lane there, but that's the specification that was used before Austin. Then the update came in Austin, and the update is now not being used on this sprint weekend. I would say that shows that the direction of the update was not necessarily the right one, but of course it's still a recent update. It's a sprint weekend. You don't have much time to sort things out, so they played it safe. So at least this weekend there will most likely be no pit lane starts for Aston Martin, which were acts of desperation because they had qualified so badly anyway. So now 3rd and 4th on the grid, they definitely don't want to start from the pit lane. Acts of desperation, there have been more and more of those from Sergio Perez recently. I don't even want to go into Mexico. You all know what happened there. Today was actually a good qualifying session, just like in Mexico. He rehabilitated himself a bit, but still only 9th on the grid for him. Why? What happened there? He was last on his Q3 lap. Was that the problem? Not really. Even if the conditions were perhaps not quite ideal, they weren't really for anyone. We'll talk about that at the very end. But he was the last to have the problem that Oscar Piastri was driving in front of him and he spun in turn 12, yellow flag. Perez had to slow down, and of course his chance of pole was gone. On pole, wait a minute, he himself says that up to that point, when he had to slow down because of the yellow flags, he was on a par with Max Verstappen. Is that really true? No, of course we looked at it in detail. In the meantime, he was already 0.5 of a second behind. In turn 12, he then caught up a bit on the sprint there, but even then he was already 0.4 of a second behind. If he had been able to keep the gap constant until the finish line, he might still have been in 3rd place, but it would definitely not have been the front row of the grid. Were those the conditions? You could say they were perhaps a little worse. On the other hand, he didn't have to queue at the pit exit, so he had well-tempered tires when he went out for his last attempt, but in the end, it still wasn't quite as good as he portrays. He completed the lap anyway. That was an instruction from the team. Why? We mustn't forget that lap times are not automatically cancelled under yellow, only under double yellow. I don't have to finish the lap anyway because it's cancelled anyway. Under yellow, I just have to take my foot off the gas significantly. There must be no danger, but I can finish my lap and the time is also counted. Now Perez just had the misfortune that Piastri spun in turn 12 of all places, and Perez took his foot off the gas wonderfully well. Cleanly, you could see that wonderfully, but you lose a lot at that point. When he was past the danger zone, he pressed the gas pedal down again, accelerated fully, but by then the baby had already fallen into the well. That's exactly where you really lose the most time on the track, because it's at the start of the long straight and you simply can't catch up, which is why he lost a lot of time there. 1.6 seconds behind in the end. I said that the field had spread out in Q3. If he had let off the gas a little less, if it had been in a slightly different place, then there would have been more in it than just 9th position for him. It was particularly bitter, as I've already mentioned, his qualifying performance up to that point, which was actually quite decent, really close to Max Verstappen in Mexico, and now only 0.5 of a second behind his teammate in Q2. Sergio Perez, everyone is talking about him at the moment, not necessarily because of his good results, but exactly the opposite. Maybe you can't hear it anymore, but maybe you can. We discussed it right next to this desk, Moritz Wimmer and I, over on our German talk channel. You can see the video there on Saturday, so feel free to take a look, subscribe to the talk channel, and then you'll get a notification immediately when the video comes online. We discuss Sergio Perez's performances, possible replacement candidates, long but also short term. After qualifying, some of you may not have noticed, there were 3 more penalties, 3 times starting positions plus 2, once for George Russell, once for both Alpine drivers, all 3 for the same offense. We mentioned it very briefly yesterday. There is an innovation in the race director notes, and this is a reaction to what happened in Mexico, where it was seen that keeping the gap no longer works in the outlap due to the delta times. It now works in the pit lane or on the way from the pit lane exit to safety car line 2. So they said they had to find a better solution somehow. They've at least optimized it again here. It's still not quite optimal, but they've said that you can no longer do it in the pit lane, but only between the pit lane exit and safety car line 2, and you have to drive to the side, here in Brazil to the left side, so that anyone who still wants to drive faster at that point can pass, and that's exactly what was the downfall of the 3 drivers. Russell was the first to get caught out in Q1. He was driving relatively centrally, so his colleagues couldn't get past. The irony of fate is that Pierre Gasly, of all people, was behind him and couldn't get past. Gasly got caught out himself afterwards. He was in the middle like his teammate, which is a wonderfully symptomatic scene, I think, because the 2 Alpine drivers are relatively central. Max Verstappen is the first to run into the 2. What does he do? He just drives around the outside, half through the grass, to get past anyway, to get the track position. Sergio Perez is right behind Verstappen, but he doesn't pass him. He stays well and good behind him. And Verstappen himself, when he passes the Alpine, slows down, drives over to the side, looks nicely in the mirror, makes sure that the two of them don't pick up speed and pass him again. So Max Verstappen is a world champion, not just in terms of the times he sets, but also in terms of what's going on in his head, how cool-headed he is. Some may say that's not fair, but it's allowed. He used it cleverly, did it properly, and therefore no penalty for Max Verstappen, but for the two Alpine drivers. For Russell, it goes from 6 back to 8. For the Alpine drivers, from 12 and 13 back to 14 and 15. Importantly, the penalties will be applied for the Grand Prix on Sunday, not for the sprint, which we will see on Saturday. Of course, thunderstorms were the big issue, and qualifying could not be completed. 4 minutes, 19 seconds were left on the clock when race director Niels Wittig pressed the button, red flag, and then it was clear that qualifying would not be restarted. On the one hand, it would have made little sense because we knew that the times would not be improved anyway, and on the other hand, it would obviously have been really dangerous. Afterwards, we saw downright horror scenes from the grandstands. The roof of one grandstand even flew off and the roof structure buckled. One photographer reported that he was almost hit by debris, but according to track officials, nobody was injured. I hope that's true. It's hard to imagine with the crowds that were there and the forces that were at work. But you could also see it during the qualifying. The pictures were spectacular. It looked as if it was night at times, as if it was a night race just without lighting. You've rarely seen such a storm during the session. Actually, the session wouldn't have been affected at all if it hadn't been postponed by 15 minutes. But there was a bit of debris on the track. There was already tire damage in free practice because of it. In between, there was a support race after which they said, okay, we want to clean it properly. As a result, the start of Q1 was postponed by 15 minutes, and so we also got caught up in this storm. So luck and bad luck, as you like to see it. The last laps in Q3 were pretty spectacular. I've already mentioned that the last drivers, Sergio Perez, didn't have optimal conditions, but nobody up front had optimal conditions. An absolute drop in temperature, and the drivers all said that the lap they were doing was absolutely disastrous. They thought something was wrong with the set of tires. They wanted to stop the laps, but in the end, everyone went through with it, and no one was better off than anyone else. If we look at the times, they were slower than in Q2 and Q1, but at least it was only 0.7 seconds for Max Verstappen. That shows once again how highly professional Formula One is. 0.7 of a second difference between the Q2 lap and the Q3 lap, and the drivers no longer understand the world, say it's undrivable and so on. That shows the level at which Formula One operates. Now you know the game on the sprint weekend. That was Friday. Friday is relevant for Sunday. Saturday has nothing to do with it at all. You can either watch this video again on Sunday before the race to see what happened, what the starting grid looks like, or you can go to our website. There's also a free app for Android and iOS, and you'll find everything you need to know about this qualifying there. There's also a results section, starting grid, where you can also see the penalties that have been applied and so on. Then maybe you don't need to watch this video again, but simply get straight to the point you want.